Well, we could just go ahead and start with the intro and get that all out of the way. My name is Matthew Mund. I'm the host today for the Northwest ACUHO First Friday webinar. I'm the current Corporate Relations Director for the Northwest ACUHO Board. I just started in March, so still figuring everything out, but I'm excited to be able to host today. And I'm with the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and so Alaska doesn't always get super engaged, but I've been in residence life since 2012, but wanted to engage more with Northwest ACUHO and have been able to do that this last year. So yeah, representing Alaska. And then in residence life, I do operations, the day-to-day kind of stuff. But yeah, and also, so I guess at this point, I want to introduce, let me see. Okay, perfect. You're admitting people. Introduce Josh. Josh is the Director of Operations for the Department of Housing and Food Services at the University of Washington. Josh's portfolio includes leading facilities operations, occupancy management, desk services, and conference services, as well as the department's emergency management program for over 10,000 residential beds and 35 food services venues. He has served as the president of the Northwest Association of College and Universities Housing Officers, or better known as Northwest ACUHO, and is the 21 to 2022 Facilities and Physical Environment Director for the ACUHO-I Executive Board. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much. It's always a mouthful with the association names. Let me get my presentation here going and make sure that we're doing the right thing. Okay. I'm sorry if my Teams is going a little bit wonky in the background. There's a small fire on campus right now that people are chatting about, so that's always fun. Let me know if you cannot see the slide deck, but I wanted to, are we good with that? Yeah,
everything looks good.
Sweet. So first off, I'm coming to you from Seattle, Washington, currently my home office, and wanted to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of the land that I am on, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, also covering the University of Washington land where our campus is. This is a topic that's a bit near and dear to my heart, having overseen the housing facilities area for the last 11 years and experienced a number of the challenges that have sort of emerged in that particular professional domain within the student housing world. And so today we're going to talk about some of those challenges and hopefully some potential solutions. But I want to acknowledge that every campus is different. And so, not every solution or idea is a one size fits all. And so my hope is that you spawn some ideas here that you can take back and tailor to your specific environment. We already did the introduction, so you know who I am now, so we can just skip over that. The iteration of today's session will start with some high-level industry and role dynamics within the facilities management and housing facilities workforce area, which helps inform some of the pipeline challenges that we're really seeing in this area right now. Then going to try to evaluate some creative methods to mentor staff into facilities roles, pipeline, analyze ways to remove barriers of folks entering and advancing in this line of work, and discuss some advocacy options for frontline and service staff. So I wanted to take a minute and give you all an opportunity to tell me, either in the chat or by unmuting, what you're hoping to get out of this session today.
I can go. We have a housing and student union facilities group and really looking to how to build the next level of leadership within that and really helping that housing expertise develop, where I think sometimes our model looks towards having a more centralized campus scenario, which is great, but we lose that housing expertise. And I want to learn how to foster that.
Thanks, Tricia. Anybody else, anything that you really wanted to make sure was covered in this session or that you walk away with? Great. So I just say, throughout the session, I'm decently good at monitoring chat. So if you pop something in there, we'll try to get to it. We'll also try to leave some time for questions at the end. So I'm just starting out, and this is now an interactive portion using the chat box. What attributes do you think of when you think of an ideal housing facilities professional? Just put some of those attributes in the chat box. What is it that they should be able to do? How they approach their work, reliable, balance of detail and global thinking. Yep, that's a good one. I, always sort of, think of people that approach it like a toilet counter type situation. And it's like, now you got to have a little more organized, good at delegating, great. Other thoughts about what an ideal housing facilities professional might have or do or bring? These are all great. Embraces change, good with conflict management, negotiation, change. So, the things I would point out here is a number of these are interpersonal skills related and soft skills related. I'm not seeing a lot of technical comments, which is interesting, and we'll touch on that later. And I would tend to agree with what you have all said. So as I sort of think about position characteristics in the housing facilities world, and whether, that position sits in campus facilities or it sits in your area or an auxiliary function, it's really the intersection of three distinct professional domains. So you've got the higher education administration area where, somebody needs to be able to navigate a higher ed environment, the personalities, the politics, the process. We often sit in student affairs. And so I saw a comment there about demographics. And so that, a good student housing professional understands the impact that the physical environment has on student development and how the behavior is influenced by environmental factors. And then, of course, the technical domain of facilities management. And it's relatively uncommon to find somebody hiring into a leadership role that sort of gets right in the middle of that domain experience. So that's just something that's good to know, that we're often going to need to acclimate or train somebody into at least one of these domains. And within your environment, based on your overall setting, you may need to decide what the emphasis is. Are we hiring for somebody that's got, sort of institutional or organizational experience, but may need to get trained up on a different area? So there's no right or wrong answer there. It also sort of depends on what other expertises you have in different areas. And, is your facilities management role structured more as like a project manager or a liaison, or someone that's managing a relationship with the campus facilities that has a depth of expertise? Or are you running your own in-house maintenance program where you need somebody that can supervise skilled trades? And so that flavor looks a little bit different. Interestingly, so this is a graphic that shows where facilities managers work from an industry perspective. And the education sector is nearly a quarter of all of the facilities managers in the United States. And the higher education sector of that is a large portion. And this makes sense, right? We have a lot of buildings, a lot of physical plant. On my campus, the student housing and dining portfolio is 11% of the entire campus from a gross square footage perspective. And so we have a lot that we're worried about and dealing with. This, just to give the source, is from Data USA, which is a collaboration of Deloitte and Data Wheel. They curate governmental data sources. So this sort of makes the case for us that this is going to be continuing to be a need in a professional area that has a lot of opportunity. There's a demographic problem in facilities management, and this also, has some pretty dramatic implications, especially when we get into a student affairs and student housing environment, which tends to be more progressive in justice, diversity, and equity and inclusion efforts. And so, this is an area that's on my mind a lot, particularly as we have in my particular shop in-house facility managers that reflect a higher level of diversity than the campus as a whole. And when they're out interacting with tradespeople, that has created some challenges and bumps. So this is the gender composition nationwide, over 80% male, under 20% female from a facilities manager perspective. As we look at it from a race and ethnicity perspective, in the United States, facilities managers are more white than the composition of the country. And I would say, if you overlaid this with the university workforce, that delta would be even more dramatic. If we look at what ACUHO-I HR did in terms of a percentage of workforce 55 years or older by job area, the skilled craft facilities and service and maintenance areas on average have a higher percentage of current workers over 55 years of age. So, this is sort of our version in this industry of the demographic cliff that we hear about with students, that we have a lot of folks that are probably pretty close to retirement. And, as Tricia said at the start, who comes next? What comes next? So as you think about all of these demographics, we have a large industry sector that is more heavily male, more heavily white than the norm, and is aging and will likely turn over. And so the time is now, and the time is right to really be thinking about how we shift this equation moving into the future. So, the other aspect, and I have observed this over the years, there is a shortage of facilities management professionals that have sort of that both cross-training of facilities expertise and also the management skills we need. And you sort of, think about, with a workforce need increasing and a labor pool decreasing, we've got a big problem. I really think that's a twofold issue. So there is a lack of exposure to the field. Who hears about facilities management in college and says that I want to be a university facilities manager for a living? I certainly didn't. It's what's known as a publicly unaware major. There's a very low number of facilities management accredited degree programs, and the ones that do exist out there tend to skew more on the technical side. And that's important. But as we talked about early on in this presentation in the chat box, there's more of a soft skill and interpersonal need. So we've got a disconnect between preparatory training and industry needs. There's both a knowledge and a skill need in this area. It spans technical and strategic. And so, this is all sort of going back to making that point of it is unlikely to find somebody out of the box that has everything you want in a position. And so I'm making the case here of thinking about how we create that pipeline and how we prepare ourselves to help people be successful coming into our environment. I did my doctoral research on competency development in university dining managers, which has some pretty significant crossover when you think about facilities managers. And it's a different professional domain, but they're both technical. They both have strong private sector presence. And so in this, we think about what competencies are, and they're often classified in specific domains and then are on a continuum or a hierarchy that inform how knowledge and skills are applied to specific jobs. Competencies are necessary to be effective in management roles. They also include technical role-based skills and universal management competencies and context-specific competencies. So as you sort of think about this, as we apply to facilities managers, they've got to have some technical level. And then these competencies that apply to all management positions, regardless of job function, are present. And then you've got the added layer of higher education context competencies. And one of the things I found in looking at a dining manager group is that dining managers we hired from the private sector were relatively unprepared for HR and financial management aspects of their job because the higher education area had higher expectations in those areas. And I've observed anecdotally the same challenge with facilities managers where, in the private sector, they're not working to the same scope as they might be here. So we sort of need to think about all of these factors, and as these elements intersect in a variety of ways, managers performing similar job types and functions in different organizational settings have different needs, and so we should acknowledge that. This is a list of core competencies identified for facilities managers. And, you look at this and think about how many of these things do we do in other areas of our professional work in student housing. There's quite a few, and we're going to get a little bit more directly into that in a little bit, but relatively few of these core competencies are specific to facilities management. So put a different way, by taking somebody that's skilled as a student housing generalist or skilled as a residential life professional and finding ways to mentor them in or prepare them for the other aspects of the job might be a really effective strategy. These are, sort of, I wasn't surprised when I saw this list, but I was like, whoa, there's a lot there that isn't facilities focused. ACUHO-I in their core competency set have a facilities management section too, and it's just interesting to note that this exists and is an opportunity to go back and look at what they're preparing people for. They look at assessment, maintenance, master planning, sustainability, and inventory as particular competency areas. And so my aside there about the ACUHO-I core competencies or the body of knowledge, if you've not seen that document, it's great in terms of looking at development programs and figuring out what areas, whether it's housing facilities or other types of positions in the housing program, someone may need to develop on. We talked a little bit previously about a disconnect between preparatory training programs and the needs of the job. And this is an example of that. So these are two training programs that exist that really focus more heavily on technical skills, a little bit on universal management competencies, and very little on a higher ed context. So the APA is the Association of Physical Plant Administrators. They have a certified educational facilities professional program that covers 4 areas, including general administration management, operations maintenance, planning, energy, et cetera. And then just as an example, UW has a certificate in facilities management that covers sort of more of that technical side. And so, what I'm making the case here for is there are opportunities to bridge a gap. And, if you haven't figured it out already, one of my arguments in this session is that we can take housing professionals and they can be quite successful in this area. And there are opportunities, if that technical aspect is missing, to develop it to a specific level that is enough for what we need to do. And these are 2 examples of that. But what these don't do is they don't bring in the soft skills that we need. And that oftentimes is the harder part when you're hiring somebody. So there are a number of barriers of entry that exist in the housing facilities world. And you all who, if you've ever tried to hire somebody, may have experienced these directly. So, the first off is a credential requirement. And, historically, facilities management leaders have had, a requirement for an engineering background or an architecture background. And that's just not often realistic in our environment. To get somebody, we can't compete with the private sector. We oftentimes don't necessarily have the same depth of need with that really strong technical background. But if our positions are structured in a way that have those requirements, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot. We also, if you think about internal progression and promotion for someone that may work up through a trades aspect, moving from that maintenance mech to a lead to a supervisor, that individual may not have a degree. And so if we're requiring a degree for a facilities manager job, we may have cut off people that have worked their way up. That technical knowledge aspect, especially as we think about people who are coming over from the housing or res life side, can be a gap. And there's also perceptions about what facilities work is and isn't. And I would, sort of reference back to those core competencies that we looked at. A lot of those are aligned with other exciting job domains. And so as I've had conversations with mid-level res life professionals who are looking to make the leap, there's a lot of skills they're able to apply in a facilities area that they didn't think about. And then the final barrier that can also exist, which also is related to promoting from within, is sometimes a language proficiency concern. And, you know, on our campus, we have a number of our facilities staff who are English as second language, and, you know, that can be a barrier. And so later in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some ways that those could potentially be mitigated. And I think our ability to mitigate these barriers will impact our ability to foster the next generation of this particular segment of the workforce. So I wanted to stop for just a minute as we've talked about industry dynamics and challenges, and see if any of you have observations on challenges that you've observed recruiting and retaining housing facilities staff. And you're free to put those in the chat box or unmute and share those. Anybody have any hot knowledge to drop here?
We recruited last year for an assistant director level and found the pool just really lacking. The successful candidate was awesome and we really lucked out, and they came through our system. But it's a more unique position, and especially in a rural area, it's hard to find someone willing to jump from a technical trade where they're paid pretty well to a management role where it's a little different in terms of compensation too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the expectations, like you'd mentioned, that there's a big difference between the private sector and the higher education. And the expectations are so much beyond what the expectations are elsewhere that, you know, it's just, there's nothing to retain them about higher education right now, when everything else, you know, it's less complicated. You don't have to deal with all these other things in other sectors. And I think that's just something that I've kind of observed, both when somebody comes in, they're not fully prepared, but also the expectations are just so beyond what they would experience elsewhere that they just get burned out really quickly.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, and I would endorse both of those as real. You know, and interestingly, you know, we've had relative success in my organization at hiring essentially residential life folks and putting them in facilities management roles, and then, you know, they're in those roles for 2 or 3 years and get trained up, and then get snatched up by the local tech companies to be facilities managers there, and it starts to become a revolving door there too. So that's you know, a dynamic that may be present as well. So let's think about some ways we can help foster the pipeline, which is starting to get more into the meat of the session. One of the things that I really think about is transferable skills. And I think we really need to think critically about how we define a good facilities professional. What transferable skills are we looking at? You know, are you hiring for attitude? Are you hiring for technical skill? Are you hiring for soft skills, or a combination of all of the above? And knowing when you're crafting a position or recruitment, what you're willing to compromise on and what you're not willing to compromise on is really, really critical. And when I, you know, back to the facilities manager core competencies that we talked about, you know, which of these do our residential life professionals bring to the table on an everyday basis? You know, they bring the managerial and the environmental competencies, the ability to navigate a higher education environment, communicate, et cetera. And so I would argue at this point, everything that I've seen in this industry, you know, we really need to be focusing on the fact that we can likely train for some level of technical skills within housing organizations. And then, you know, the other thing I would say is, how can we build a broader recognition within our organizations that facilities work is student development work? It's just at a different layer and a different level. You know, you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a relatively basic human development concept, but, you know, essentially, you know, a student can't develop community or build relationships if they don't feel safe in their room, or if their roof is leaking or their mattress is uncomfortable. And so it's all part of a continuum. And as we start to evangelize this profession within our organizations, and try to attract some folks to become interested in it that we can then develop into the roles, that is really an important mental shift, because I grew up as a residential life person, and we don't always think about these opportunities or options or a different way to apply our skills. So, as I sort of remove the things that a residential life professional may not bring to the table, there's still quite a bit left here. We also need to think about inclusivity. Claudia Laverne Brand-Woody is an American business executive VP at IBM. She as well in the Out and Equal Trailblazer Award, and named one of the 100 Women We Love. And I just love this quote: inclusivity means not just we're allowed to be there, but that we are valued. I've always said smart teams will do amazing things, but truly diverse teams will do impossible things. And in the facilities management world, often the frontline workforce is significantly diverse. Certainly our customer and student base is as well. And so we need to be looking at corners of our organization where there is underrepresentation and actively seeking out inclusive and diverse perspectives to bring into roles. How do we make everyone feel valued in this type of work? And so it's not only pipeline or getting the right people in the right seats, but then having the right support mechanisms for staff that might be underrepresented in this line of work. And I've got a couple female facility managers on my team that will routinely articulate challenges they have working with trades folks who may have a different way of thinking, and that's never appropriate and is addressed, but it's a reality there, and it's something that we need to acknowledge. And like I said, the student life and residential life professions are a bit more advanced in this area, and so for someone coming over to something that's not quite so advanced, it can be a bit of a stark challenge. So pipeline strategy number 1. The old concept of mentorship. This is something that we've worked on our campus to develop what I call a facilities management 101 program that isn't necessarily formally or officially offered, but has been delivered on more of an ad hoc basis, where our housing facilities leadership identify folks that might be interested in exploring this career path. And typically they're resident directors who may be in year 2 or 3 and looking to what's next. And in working with them through a series of readings, conversations, discussions, they start to understand the vocabulary, the key issues, some of those baseline things that can help A, evaluate whether this line of work is of interest to them, but B, also give them sort of the baseline information and knowledge they may need to at least get through some interview processes. And of the folks that have gone through this program on our campus, we've had 2 or 3 that have ended up getting facilities management jobs in our organization and have been quite effective and successful in those roles. So, it's not necessarily everything you need to know about everything in the world, but it's sort of helping spark the interest and excitement and identify opportunities for future growth and engagement. So that's something, particularly if you've got somebody on your campus or in your organization that is positioned to be in a bit of a mentorship role, consider starting up something either informally or formally that can help do that internally. And, Tricia said that she's had some success hiring internally, and that, I really believe is a good path, because they know the environment. The ACUHO-I housing internship program is also a way to help develop a pipeline here. And about 8 years ago, we'd always had residential life interns and on and off conference services interns. And we developed an internship for the facilities area that was pretty broad-based and gave interns exposure to every aspect of the facilities operation, and also was quite effective at doing some work that we needed during the summer, which was an otherwise busy time. And we found that we were one of the few internship opportunities that was focused on facilities. And so the individuals that ended up applying for that were quite excited to develop that competency area. And that's something that, they can walk away on their resume and may help bridge that gap of knowledge. That's also a good way to be an ambassador and, potentially find someone that could be interested in working for you later on. If you're not familiar with this program, I strongly encourage you to look into it. It's really just a great opportunity to get some pipeline development here. The third pipeline strategy that we've implemented on our campus is a collateral assignment with our residential life team. And this is typically a summer opportunity. It's been on COVID hiatus because we've had some workforce issues in the residential life area. But what this opportunity does is give an opportunity for 1 or 2 resident directors to come over and work in facilities for usually 30 hours a week during the summer. And we tie that opportunity back to competencies. We generally still take them through that facilities management 101 program, so they have learning opportunities, but also assign them project work that they're able to do and learn and grow. And then they walk away at the end of the summer, both a better residential life professional because they're bringing back some knowledge of what happens on the other side, but also, again, potentially having sparked an interest in the facilities world. So that's something that, if your resident directors are on 12-month appointments and aren't quite so busy over the summer, that might be an opportunity for you to consider something like this. And we also have done this in our housing assignments area and our conferences area. So, and the resident directors quite enjoy it. So those are 3 ways to consider internally within your sphere of control to increase an internal pipeline for positions. I want to pivot a little bit and think about our recruiting process. The way we build our recruiting process can help ensure that we're reducing some of those barriers of entry that we talked about. For those with transferable skills, as well as those looking to advance and overcome some of the other considerations. One of the things I always say in this particular line of work is that a good interviewer, someone that's interviewing for a job, doesn't necessarily mean a good professional, particularly in the facilities management world. And so we need to, in some ways, sort of flip the way we're thinking about interviewing and really focus on what is going to tell us if someone's got the capability to do that job, not necessarily what is going to tell us someone is good at participating in an interview. So some of the things that I just think are fundamental in recruiting that we can sometimes stray away from are these. So, particularly in this area, make sure that we've got a clear position description and job posting. Sometimes it's easy to get that 5 or 10 page PD, and then somebody that isn't familiar with the higher education world may not really even be able to sort through it and understand, what level is this position? Is it something that I qualify for and I'm interested in? So that's just a best practice all around, and particularly in an area where you want to attract a private sector, potentially applicant pool, thinking about that. Also eliminating higher ed specific jargon. So if we're using a bunch of language that is only specific to our industry, again, that's going to create some barriers and challenges for folks that are not in the higher education sphere already. I'd also say think really hard about what the minimum qualifications for the position are. Does it really require a master's degree, or is a master's degree nice? Do you really need an engineer? Or is somebody that's got some other set of experience okay? And I would argue for, certainly establishing minimum qualifications that are really truly minimum qualifications, but don't add on a bunch of stuff there that isn't really necessary, because then you prevent people from even applying or thinking about the position, and so it's easier to sort of set lower minimums and then screen for preferred type stuff than it is to have too high of a bar and end up with a crappy pool because you have eliminated opportunities. review your application process through an equity lens. And that's making sure that we're really asking for competency-based interview questions and aspects that are truly inclusive and not inadvertently limiting people that are successful through that process. And then I know there are always some institutional restrictions about this, but post the salary, if you are able to, that levels the playing field, and again, can not waste time on either side if there, are people that are looking for a certain thing in that aspect. Interestingly, the state of Washington has a new law coming out next year that requires this, and I personally think that's a good thing. On the equity side of things, on average, and this is, an aggregation and a generalization, but there's data that suggests that typically women will apply for jobs only when they qualify for 100% of the qualifications listed, but men will apply for a job when they meet 60% of the minimum qualifications. So if you've not thought really hard about how you structure those minimum qualifications, you may inadvertently then create a gender gap in your applicant pool and people that may be successful. The other thing on salary, I'd say that if you're unable to post it per institution policy, disclose it as early in the process as you're able to. One way to help remove or reduce bias in an interview process, which is really important in the facilities line of work, is approaching interviews from a competency-based perspective. And so, for example, a competency might be collaboration and teamwork. And you see here on the screen an interview question that is related to that collaboration and teamwork, but understanding why we're asking that question in the first place, and that it is related to a specific competency that is required for the role, helps ensure that we're unveiling the right things in an interview process. One of the other things in the interviewing process that we have started to do is to either distribute the question set ahead of time or a bullet point list of what they may be expected to speak to in an interview. And particularly in the facilities world, I've observed that this makes a night and day difference. And some of the concerns with doing this are that people will come in with sort of memorized answers, but what it's ended up doing is allowed folks to think about good examples ahead of time. And that way, we're not interviewing someone's ability to immediately come up with a great example. We really want to learn about their experience. And so giving some time to reflect on that ahead of time has yielded a lot higher quality of responses. So here's on the screen an example of a way we've done that. Send them an email ahead of time saying, please be prepared to discuss or provide examples on the following topics. And then those bullet point topics are related to the questions that we ask. And I find that sort of a good balance. I don't personally provide the specific questions, but I do something like this. It's just like I said, we train residential life staff to be great at interviewers. We don't train facilities staff or others to do the same thing. So this can help bridge that gap. Trying to using a skill-based approach as we look at more of a service staff perspective and, more of a maybe like entry-level supervisor lead type positions is really critical. So, I strongly advocate to try to get as close to understanding their ability to do the job as possible. A custodian, for instance, doesn't sit in a meeting talking routinely as part of their job. They clean. And so one of the things we've implemented into our service and frontline positions is experiential portion of that interview where we'll actually, for a custodian, take them into a bathroom and just have them talk through the way they would approach cleaning in that bathroom. And that removes pressure, it removes tension. It's helped with some of the language considerations. And it helps tell us, do they know how to do the job in a different way than it would be, just with an interview question. We have our paint team go into a room and point out how they would mask it off and tape it off. We have our supervisors go and look at apartment turn that's been done and observe anything that they may have concerns with or do differently. And so those are things to think about. What is it that someone is actually expected to do in their job? And I tell you this because this translates also to management positions. And so one of the things that we've implemented in facilities manager hiring processes is a case study. And so in this example, we essentially provide some narrative and a set of incident reports that came in over the weekend and ask the candidate to discuss what considerations they would use to prioritize the issues. And we're not looking for how they would actually solve it, but what are the things you think about? And that starts to cut through any specific, technical knowledge and really gets to, can they understand the impact of an issue on safety or on a customer? And do they have the critical thinking and problem solving skills to start to align, a workforce? So, how do they think about this job regardless of their level of technical knowledge? And so this is an area that has helped, evaluate candidates coming from a residential life perspective in, how they would then apply that experience into facilities. And so, all of this to say, I would really encourage you to look at your interview and recruitment processes and flip them on their head a little bit, and don't just do business as usual higher ed search process. Think about what it is that's necessary to do the job and how can we align more and be nimble like the private sector. Curious if any of you have seen any unique interview strategies that you'd like to share. If you do, feel free to pop them in the chat box, and hopefully this is giving you a little bit of juice to marinate on. So, we've talked about recruitment, we've talked about pipeline. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about employee development strategies. And, this is really from a lens of assuming everything we've talked about so far is real, that it's unlikely we're going to have a candidate walk through the door with everything that we need day one in the job, given the constraints in higher education. So, one of the things is thinking about how we can bridge skill gaps. And, again, sort of related to my dissertation with dining managers, I really wanted to understand how we could prepare managers to do their job better. And I had some assumptions. You think about a dining manager out in the field a lot, that perhaps, in person might be the way to go here. But what we found was that an online training and development program can be extremely effective in preparing managers, particularly for some of those more, either technically related skills like financial management that has, a specific methodology to it, or some of the HR pieces or facilities pieces. And so don't just assume that folks need an in-person curated experience. You can get some bang for your buck in figuring out what competencies are generally missing in that segment of professionals, and perhaps working with your HR team or learning and development to develop some training modules that help get over some of those gaps. And that I found that, that competency-based training approach is effective in preparing managers to meet expectations of their job. And if we do effective competency development work with managers, they are able to better advance and fulfill organizational mission. So, sort of making the case that this approach can be effective. As we think about, our frontline and service staff, who in a perfect world would be able to advance up through their ranks and become eligible to be a supervisor, lead, or manager, that has been a pretty significant ceiling and stopping point for us. And I think part of it is role dynamics, but part of it is that we just don't have a really effective way to take somebody and to start to develop those other aspects of the job that they're going to need to do. And so we've implemented a conference style training approach with our custodial and maintenance team that not only covers your routine safety trainings once a year, typically during winter break, but we've then infused in developmental training topics like how to write a resume, communication skills, things like that, that help them build their toolbox so that when they are interviewing for that next position, they're better braced to do that. And we think that's good business for us, helps remove some barriers to advancement. We've started offering English in the workplace training through local community college for staff on an annual basis. And that, one of the things that we found, particularly looking at our lead and supervisor positions, is that language barrier has been a significant impediment. And so through this program, employees have been able to effectively improve their English from a work-based perspective, and then are more successful in advancing. As well as computer skills training. Most of the workforce now has a basic expectation that you know how to use a computer and use it well, but that isn't always the reality. And so we've offered training in that to our staff, and has been pretty effective. So as we think about new managers, one of the things I would say that is, if you hire for the managerial competencies that we've talked about, you may need to train on the technical skills. And that's just a reality that I've accepted and accommodated for. And so one of the areas that we focused on is making sure that new managers in our shop that don't have that strong facilities background, that we get them into the APA Institute for Facilities Management relatively early in their tenure. And what that starts to do is, essentially give them enough information to understand what the priorities, the issues, the vocabulary, the trends are, so that they can go back and work with our campus trade shops more effectively. In my operation, we have generalist maintenance mechanics and some painters in-house, but not the real heavy skilled trades. And so I don't have the same need for strong technical expertise of how the plumbing widget works that you might in a different setting. And so that's important to know. And this has been a real great way to do that. We also have an expectation that they job shadow technicians and get out into the field. And so, you can't just sit at your desk and have the electrician call and explain the problem to you, set the expectation that they actually go out and see it, and set up some formal time for managers to work with techs and go out and understand what their issues and challenges and opportunities are. So these are all ways to, sort of start to accommodate for a lack of strong technical knowledge coming in. Couple of things in conclusion, and then we'll have a few time for questions and comments. Compensation is a real issue in this area. And I think it is important to acknowledge that. Skilled trades frontline salaries are increasing at a necessary rate. I know here in Seattle, the labor market for our maintenance staff is very strong. And we need to consider how management fits into this, and recognize that the facilities professional domain may be different, and it may be okay, than a residential life professional domain or some other aspect of our operation. And necessarily compensation structures may need to acknowledge that as well. We have had that discussion quite a bit in our area, where, housing facilities sits in housing, which sits in student life, which is historically a lower paid aspect than other areas of campus. And we started to have some real compression problems with campus facilities, and then with our trade staff and having a supervisor make more than their manager. And so we've been working through some adjustments there, but it took a bit of a shift in thinking of understanding that the nature of the work and the skills exerted may be different, and that may be okay. Now, that said, I think all of our staff need to be paid more, bar none, but this is a particular area that's an issue. I was in a union negotiation conversation yesterday that was talking about some across the board increases for frontline skilled trades that, again, create compensation compression issues with their managers. So this is a reality, and it's something you may need to manage for. Just want to, since we only have 9 minutes left, open it up for any questions folks have, or if you've got commentary you'd like to make, let's do it.
I'll just say I'm from an architecture firm. We do a lot of work with universities on housing projects, and it's really interesting to hear some of the challenges and things that you're looking at in recruiting and retention align with things that we're going through as an organization as well. it's just an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I was talking with a architect here in Seattle a couple months ago, and he was saying that new grads coming in, new associates coming in, are expecting salaries that match, what some of the associates and are making out with 10 years of experience. And so it's just challenging all around.
And I think the you've got some creative strategies there. Real interesting stuff. We've been talking a lot about pipelines and diversity in our organization as well. Noticing some real sort of similar currents between two industries.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, by the way.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Anything else on anybody's mind this morning?
Well, thanks, Josh. I was going to kind of tap on that last little comment you made about just the structure. I don't know if this is common at other institutions, but we have like a small internal facilities department and then the university-wide facilities department. And pretty much, we do things like furniture and things not attached to the walls. The university facilities does all of the work for anything with the facility itself. And because we're within residence life and student affairs, and the rest of the university facilities is under administrative services, it is really difficult to have those kind of compensation conversations, when that structure is so different for residence life. I don't know if any institution has completely separated that out, where there's no facility staff, but underneath the residence life or housing umbrella, or I should say student affairs umbrella.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue that I could probably speak for an hour about, because you have a million different flavors. But, there are universities there that just have sort of one person that serves as a liaison with campus facilities, and most of the work is done by campus facilities. And then vice versa. And this is typically more the case with very large housing programs, where they'll do everything in-house. And then you've got every flavor in between. And what I ended up finding at our institution is that the facilities managers in my area had a larger building portfolio than those on central campus, and they had just a higher expectation of level of service, because we're working with areas that people live and work in. And so the complexity of their job was actually higher, and the compensation was significantly lower. And we've not fully corrected that, but it's something that's on my mind for sure. Oregon State University is an example of a university that has worked to correct some of those issues. And what they did about 10 years ago was a university-wide compensation structure change, where they put positions into a job family regardless of what department it sat in. And so all of the facilities folks campus-wide, whether they were in housing, residence life, athletics, or central campus, got put into that family, and pay equity happened in that model. That's obviously not something we can necessarily control at our level, but is an interesting way to think about it. I certainly enjoy having the in-house staff in housing that we do. I think if anything, our inclination is to go more in that direction versus more to campus, because it serves our mission better, but there's some challenges with it.
Yeah, that is interesting. We tend to lose people just to our wider university facilities department. So we bring them in, get them all trained, and then they're like, oh, look, these people over here that do pretty much the same job I do, but it's way less stressful. So they're still within the university, but not in housing. So.
Yeah, it's a different level of stress and expectation maintaining a home than it is an academic building, for sure. With our last 2 or 3 minutes, anything else? Well, I really appreciate your time. Feel free to email me or contact me offline if you want to do any follow-up or continue the conversation. These are the references I used in this presentation, and I appreciate Northwest ACUHO facilitating the First Friday webinar. Matthew, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, thank you so much. There was a ton there that I feel like I've maybe heard a piece of your presentation in the past, and you saying things, I think there's some of your presentation that's like inside of my way of thinking now that you've given in the past. So it's a great job. But just to the general group, Northwest ACUHO is constantly looking for engagement from our members. So if anybody's interested in doing a First Friday like this, providing some content to our members, or participating, we do have some open board positions. We do have active committees for professional development, like the university kind of committees that we're always looking for people to engage with. So feel free to contact me or any of the other board members if you are interested. It's a very low, like, there's not a ton of time involved. We're just looking for more people just to kind of raise their hand and be willing to engage a little bit more. And also, just as a general save the date, you probably saw it in the last newsletter, but our first in-person conference since COVID started is going to be up in Calgary in February. So if you haven't done it already, think about that a little bit, and at least save the date on your calendars. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday, and until next time.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.